COP29 is called the Finance COP, and the reason is that it's called that is that there's a new climate finance goal on the negotiation table. This new goal will cover the 2025 to 2030 period, which will be absolutely decisive in terms of climate action, of course. It's well known that a strong outcome on finance on COP29 will have major impacts, really major impacts on the world's response to the climate crisis. In particular, it would empower countries to adopt bolder climate commitments and increase investments in critical areas as adaptation and also, of course, health. But what does a strong outcome really entail? Who's making these decisions, and what are the driving forces behind these decisions? Lucky for us, we have three experts here in the studio from the United Nations Development Programme to help us understand these fairly complicated topics. So please welcome to the studio. We have Susanne Olbrisch, Global Climate Policy Specialist at UNDP, and Rohini Kohli, Senior Advisor, Adaptation Planning and Policy at UNDP, and Natalia Linou, Deputy Director, HIV and Health at UNDP. Terrific to have all three of you here in the studio. So Susanne, let's start with you. Why is it so important to get this agreement on the new climate finance goal, and what is the risk if we really don't get this agreement here at COP29?
Thank you. And yes, it may seem obvious that climate action requires climate finance. At the same time, it may be much less obvious how much finance specifically that should be, and how much of that finance would be carried by individual countries, and how much of that would be needed to provided by the richer countries to those that suffer the most. So already in 2009-10, the world agreed on a big goal on climate finance to provide 100 billion per year, and as we know, the world has struggled to reach that goal for a very long time. And with the OECD figures that we see that are saying that the goal has been met for the first time in 2022, there's countries that are challenging these figures because they also include non-grants finance, so there's all this debate. At the same time, what we can say for sure is that in every other year this goal has not been met. So clearly there is a need to come up with a new goal on climate finance. It needs to be bold in terms of the target, it needs to be specific in terms of who should contribute, what types of finance would actually count under this goal. Then also whether there would be any specific allocations for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. We may probably also see different flows for different regions or for specific groups of countries, such as least developed countries or small developing island states. So in a summary, really, we need to see a bold target, and this COP is really the time that will define climate finance going forward.
Thank you very much, Susanne. So turning to you, Rohini, is adaptation finance sufficiently represented in discussions here at the COP, and why is it important to direct some of this finance towards adaptation in developing countries? Could you please elaborate a bit on this?
I think here at the COP, the discussion is about climate finance as a whole. And the discussions around the new collective goal on climate finance do include adaptation. But in terms of the estimates that have come out most recently by the UN Environment Programme, there's a significant, there's a huge need. They've costed the national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions, and there is, estimates, range up to even 300 billion that is needed per year to support developing countries on really meeting their, adaptation investments. And I think there is a large discussion involving a lot of actors at the COP, but it remains to be seen what will be the final outcome of the negotiations and what part of that will really be, earmarked for adaptation. But there is, I think, some light on the horizon, because originally there was a goal to double adaptation finance, and that has been met. However, there is still a significant sort of deficit on the issue of adaptation finance. So I think there's a lot yet to be seen as to what the outcome will be.
Thank you. So Natalia, climate change affects many aspects of society, and one of them that is profoundly, near to all of us is health, correct? So what kind of Well, can you talk to us about some of the aspects here that is related to climate financing and health? What are the correlations here?
Of course. Thank you so much for that question. And I think it's important when we're talking about finance to think about why. Why are we talking about finance? We're actually talking about people and the impacts of climate inaction on people. So the public health community, I'm a social epidemiologist myself, really think about the vast range of climate impacts. We are seeing it in terms of infectious diseases, the malarias and dengue and more vector-borne diseases in communities that have never had it before. We're seeing it in terms of non-communicable diseases, heat, extreme heat, as well as air pollution. And we're seeing it in mental health impacts. So the toll is huge. In fact, the World Bank launched a report here yesterday on the cost of inaction on climate and said that it could cost 21 trillion to the globe in terms of the health costs, just treating people from the health damages that we're seeing. So finance and health are intricately linked, because if we don't invest sufficiently, if we do not set up adaptation systems so that our health systems are able to really truly address this rising epidemic that we're seeing, we're going to be in a situation much worse. So oftentimes in the media we see the extreme weather events and the injuries and the deaths. That's just the tip of the iceberg. It's truly a much, much bigger health crisis that is emerging, and it's because it's happening both in terms of infectious and non-communicable diseases. Health systems are feeling overwhelmed, and so we have to take action because the climate crisis is a health crisis.
Thank you very much, Natalia. In terms of investment, what kind of numbers are we looking at here?
So there, I'll let my colleague talk about sort of the numbers, but I think, a lot of the advocacy community is calling for additional funding. So we're hearing from health ministers who are saying, please don't ask us to repurpose our HIV funds for climate. This needs to be additional. People are saying over 1 trillion overall. I'm not saying that all of it will go to the health sector, but in fact, if it's smartly allocated, it can have health benefits. So smartly allocated public transportation can address the air pollution and have health benefits. Investing in agriculture and food security can have impacts in terms of nutrition and child nutrition. So, there are, of course, investments that need to go into the health sector, and that's important, but also other investments can be aligned so that they have a health benefit. And I should say that the health sector is trying to play a part, their role. Their role in all of this is saying, how do we mitigate our sort of carbon footprint? So there's real initiatives around low carbon, resilient health infrastructure. So one, to be resilient to disasters so that you don't wipe out the one clinic that you have in your community, but also in more wealthier communities to say, how can we green our supply chain? How can we use renewable energies? And UNDP has been involved in a lot of these initiatives to green the health sector, and other partners with the World Health Organizations and others. So it's both the health sector saying we will do our part, but there has to be financing so that we do not see the impacts in a few years' time. And then it's, as we learned from COVID, then it's a bit too late.
Thank you, Natalia. So going back to you, Rohini, when you talk about adaptation, what would you say are the most pressing needs here? And also, where should the countries focus their finances when it comes to adaptation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Adaptation needs are kind of context specific, but yet we know that there are lots of sectors which are really at risk due to climate. I think agriculture, in many countries has a huge contribution to the economy, and agriculture is, severely impacted by climate change. As Natalia mentioned, health, is another area which, in many of the countries around the world, there are vector-borne diseases, there's heat stress, there's issues of cooling. So that's another key sector. But, we are increasingly seeing that there are actually, it's almost all the sectors of the economy, particularly the economic sectors, but there are also a lot of social sectors which are impacted. And ultimately, the impacts are felt by communities on the ground that don't necessarily think of this sector or that sector. It's actually their livelihoods, it's health, so there is, I think, even energy systems which are seen as in the climate change world. Energy is a mitigation issue. It's actually very, very major adaptation issue, because hydropower, energy systems, all of those are greatly impacted by climate change, and these are very, very strong adaptation priorities for countries. And I think what, and clearly there is a huge amount of support required, not just in terms of financing, but also there's technology, there's capacity building. So where should countries really invest, their, scarce resources? I mean, we know that there's a very large percentage of domestic budgets that are already going towards adaptation. In fact, UNDP is working with several countries to, kind of tag and track those. And also because of the vast needs that are there, there are also initiatives, working with at the national level, with the integrated national financing frameworks, with the national adaptation plans, the NDCs. There are financing strategies being developed. There are also green taxonomies being developed, to help, make sure that the private sector can start coming in. There are also, different financial instruments, bonds. There are also, there's a discussion about, debt for nature swaps. I mean, so there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done by countries on the financial part of this. And so it's not to direct investment into those sectors. There actually the financial system itself needs to be fit for purpose, which means working across the whole of government, across the whole of society. So to direct investment, in the critical areas, and these critical areas are earmarked often in the countries, increasingly in the development plans of countries, but a lot of that detail or the priorities are actually coming from the adaptation plans, in the case of adaptation, and the NDCs themselves are identifying those key topics where more investment will need to be directed. And it's, I think, important to say that when you ask the question, where should investment be directed? I mean, the investment has to be really seen also in a development sense. It's really to climate-proof the development sectors of the country. So I think it's very, very context-specific, but these are some of the key sectors, food, agriculture, food, health, energy systems, water. I mean, these are where the critical investments lie for adaptation. And these are actually the hardest to reach sectors because often it's public budgets that are funding a lot of that action. So, and that public budget tends to be very scarce. And that's why the discussion in this COP is also about, what is the provision of public finance globally? How much will it leverage private finance? So it's a very live discussion, but so countries can't just think about investment, but our SG has said, the UNSG, that every country needs to have an adaptation investment plan. So it's not only about identifying the priorities, but where should the investments go, but also what are the financial instruments? I mean, we have to think about, new financial instruments to really tackle this challenge, along with the very traditional, sources of finance which are being discussed. And I think a range of these are being discussed at the COP here.
Thank you. So in terms of best practices and just in general progress and advice how to tackle these different, very diverse topics, how are these pieces of information and knowledge, how are they being shared from your perspective? I mean, because I guess that is key, that we really don't make the same mistakes in different parts of the world, that we really learn from each other's mistakes and also share the successes, correct?
Yeah, well, I think there are different forums, there are, the COP is primarily about negotiation, but there's also a huge gathering of, countries that are also sharing their experiences. There are, civil society voices. It's across, so there is a lot of sharing that happens on the sidelines of the COPs. There is also sharing that happens on the sidelines in the main lines of the climate weeks, and UNDP is very much a part of those climate weeks along with the UNFCCC. There are regional forums, there are even UNDP is working with the Coalition for Finance Ministers. So they are, sort of meetings of finance ministries. So, I mean, from UNDP's point of view, I think we are actually part of, sort of really supporting different communities of practitioners to share these experiences. So it's happening at the global level, the regional level, and often, also between, I think with our workshops on the NDC 3.0 this year, there was a lot of regional sharing on the NDCs, on the NAPs, and also around the financing around these. So there are quite a lot of forums where countries are able to share their experiences outside of the negotiations, to learn from this.
Thank you very much. So Susanne, what's next now in terms of this conversation? How will this conversation in the area of climate finance evolve in the future, and let's say over the next few years? And what should we keep an eye out for?
Yes, we'll certainly see very, very high demands for finance. And the thing is, finance exists. It has to be spent in the right places. We do see that there's a large number of countries, developing countries, who are spending a considerable part of their national domestic budget on climate-related activities. And imagine how much more we can free up if fossil fuel subsidies were abolished. And of course, the needs for finance will remain very high in the future. UNDP is also working with countries in supporting them to identify and articulate these needs by not only adding up different costs, but by really looking into how this can be financed, how can finance be allocated, where can be strategic entry points for investments of additional financing coming in. So really in that sense, yes, addressing climate change will cost a lot. And at the same time, we're seeing all the aggravating effects of climate change causing huge costs. And we have policymakers across the world seeing that also non-action comes at a high cost. And that helps putting into perspective the cost of addressing climate change, and therefore helps making a business case for climate action.
Thank you, Susanne. So, final question here. When we see climate havoc happening in Spain, and I mean many parts of Western Europe, and also of course in the richer parts of the world, as in other richer parts of the world as the United States. What impact can this have on this discussion of climate finance? It's no longer just the developing countries that are suffering, but now it's also hitting closer to home, so to speak, to the countries and the decision makers that really do have a stronger wallet.
I think it's sort of becoming very real to people that this is what they're experiencing in their daily lives. So and that so it's not a discussion just happening at the COP. And as you mentioned already, a few countries in Western Europe, a lot of countries in Africa, in Asia, all of them are feeling it. And I think it does have an impact because people are experiencing it. And one of the things we've seen in the negotiations is also that countries, regardless of their income level, are actually preparing adaptation plans. So we know that for example, Canada has prepared an adaptation plan. Just like a lot of developing countries, we know 60 countries have prepared their adaptation plans, and these are really cutting across income levels. And I think there are also increasingly, there's a bit more evidence now that by investing a bit more now, the World Bank has estimated if you invest $1 in resilient infrastructure, you might get more in benefits. So I think there is also that recognition coming. But the most powerful thing is that people all over the world are feeling this, and it will have an effect on these discussions.
And also the longer the awareness that the longer you wait, the more costly it will be in human lives and also in finance, correct?
Definitely, and that would be linking to another part of Outlook in terms of many countries, especially developing countries, are in debt stress or indebted or face challenges in accessing the capital market. And so that's another element that we would see upcoming more and more over the last 2 years actually, that there's a growing number of countries who see this as a systemic issue and who are calling for a reform of the global financial architecture. And we can see that over the last 2 years this has really gained traction, this idea, from more general ideas in the beginning to now quite specific proposals. We are seeing from the Bridgetown initiative, as well as from a group that is the Independent Expert Group on Climate Finance. So different groups of experts and countries that are coming together in making this a very concrete set of proposals in terms of how to reform the global financial architecture to make it fit for purpose for the challenges of the current time.
Thank you very much, Susanne. And Natalia, you addressed mental health earlier in your statement here, and when you look at the mental state of our youth globally, there is a high number of existential anxiety and worry directly connected to the climate crisis. So in terms of addressing this with finance, you need money of course, to address this. If we don't do it, I imagine that we will have a generation of people that are not really ready to act because they will be so paralyzed by dread. There is even a book called Generation Dread, right, about this.
the connection between climate change and mental health is actually still, like, we're still learning more every day. For example, there was a new paper that came out that for every degree of more heat, there is an increase in suicidal ideation and rates of suicide among youth. So, there are direct impacts, and then there's the indirect, this understanding of young people that we are leaving them a world that is worse off. And it's difficult because we don't want to medicalize that. We don't want to say you need to see a psychiatrist because these are real threats. They're not, made up. So, but what we're learning is that actually coming together, the sort of mobilizing civil society, youth being part of a community and feeling that there is something that can happen, that they can do, that there is hope, that someone is listening, is part of actually the mental health support that they need. And so UNDP has a commitment to including young people in the decision making and in the negotiations, and a commitment also for gender equality, indigenous people. And I think that's part of understanding what health and well-being requires. In a moment of real crisis, of real hardship, being part of the solution is actually a mental health strategy. And so we need to be there with everyone being at the table.
So I'm going to check with my tech team now because my in-ear isn't really working. Well, then I see the clock here. It's actually, we're ending right on time here. Even if we don't have time, we're ending right on time. So thank you very much, Natalia, Susanne, and also, of course, wonderful to speak to you, Rohini, about this. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and keep up the fantastic work. And I hope I will be able to interview you again next year in Brazil and see that there's been much progress over the year that's passed. Thank you.
Thank you.